Hello and welcome. Does age or physical capacity matter in public service? I can assure you it is the 14th of August today. If you saw the wrong screen, uh, we apologise. Well, welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford, the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to this, the 46th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button and not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session and I will try and put them into the panel to consider later on. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so we don't have a bottleneck at the end. I'm looking forward greatly in this electoral year and very important electoral year to this discussion. Over to you, Sandy.
Thanks very much, Mike. Yes, the UK has already done its share in this important electoral year, and the American turn is coming up along with many others around the world, which does make this a timely topic. We have a wonderful group of people assembled today to discuss this. I would introduce first John Battle, a former Labour Party MP in the United Kingdom, representing Leeds West. Now I think nominally retired from politics, but still very much involved with affairs of state and questions like this. M.T. Connolly, an elder justice expert from the University of California, which is in Los Angeles, although she is in Washington, D.C. today. She is a legendary term, a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellow, for her efforts to sort out the questions of how to make longevity more joyful, gentle, and just for people of all ages. We're also joined by Richard Thomas from Wales, who has been a member of the Wales Career Board and since February 2020, and very much a person involved in evaluating whether people are qualified for the jobs that they hold or are about to be named to, and whether there are any issues. I want to start with the most obvious place, MT. The United States, in a very short time ago, a month ago or less, was faced with this question of whether one of the two principal candidates for president of the United States was capable of carrying on his campaign because of a particular debate performance that President Biden had. And really, I think it's fair to say we didn't know what to do or how to do it. And in the 21st century at this stage, with candidates the ages that the two principal candidates then were and one still is, we were caught flat-footed about what to do. So if you could sort of take the larger view of this and talk about Western democratic societies for a moment and how ready we are to make some of these very crucial and worrisome judgments.
Well, first, thanks so much for having me, Sandy, and all. You know, it's sort of shocking to me how flat-footed we are when it comes to aging, because the aging of society and the changing demographics are no surprise. In 1900, Americans lived an average of 48 years, and by 2000 and still today, it's an average of 78 years. And in the UK, you're a little ahead of us with an average of about 80 years, I think. And so, you know, in a sense, our aging politicians reflect an aging society. Of course, we've always, you know, I mean, Cicero was writing about aging statesmen, and so it's not a new issue per se, but the number of aging politicians and the disproportionate age of the people who represent us, I think, is a new issue. And in a sense, you know, as go Biden and Trump and Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi, so go we all. And one of the issues is that we don't want to think about aging really in any sort of integrated way. And, you know, I've tried to write about this, but we're very unprepared for all aspects of an aging society, whether it is issues of care or the economy or issues of governance. And so I think it's fantastic that you're having this conversation. And, you know, it's a reflection, I think, that the systems of both governance and health and everything else, you know, retirement and all that we have are built for younger people, are built for people who live 70 years, not 70 years. So I think that having conversations like this is incredibly important. And in terms of thinking about better strategies to navigate these really complicated questions about the experience and wisdom that older politicians bring versus the potential incapacities.
Thanks, MT. John Battle, I want to ask you, don't forget to unmute. There you go. In the UK, how are these things handled differently? The Labour Party has had some turnover in its leadership in recent years, more than once. And how do you, what are the signs and what do you do? And not just for who's fit to be prime minister, who's fit to be the you know, the local council member or the milkman for that matter. You know, how do we judge physical, mental capabilities for people to do their important jobs?
Wow, and not very well. And in a way, I think it ebbs and flows. I mean, at the present time, I think the biggest after the election, the biggest challenge that has been around for some time and that's merging is the relationship between generations, intergenerational questions. In the last Parliament of the Conservatives, there were great questions that pensioners did really well, and it was the young that were left out. We've now got a new government, and one of the first acts was to reduce some of the funds for pensioners, and suddenly there's a great row again whether the pensioners are being hit and not the young. And that question of who benefits, and the reason for the row at the present time after the new parliament's been elected is Keir Starmer's 61, but the average age of his cabinet is down to 47, which is one of the youngest, and the MP group of the 651 MPs is also a younger group than we've ever had in history. So there's a kind of feeling that the youngsters have moved in and they're going to hit the pensioners. So these tensions are around. But there are also the questions about, I think, a larger question that hits political parties, and that's how do you renew yourself when you're in power? How do you manage succession properly, so that you retain the power, of course, and remain the government, but have leadership in that's fresh, young, and with new ideas without people hogging the space, as it were, and really holding on to the illusion of power for longer than they ought to. And I think those are two big questions that are live in our politics now, intergenerational challenges, and then and I think it's not just politics, actually, how do institutions renew themselves and keep going, doing what they're meant to do. And I think that's a real challenge, because quite often those institutions crash because they manage the hand-on badly.
Richard Thomas, thank you very much, John. I think there's some you've made some memorable comments there, actually, about just what we're all facing. Surely you've thought about this, not just mental capacity, but also physical capacity. How does someone, does there come a time when one walks into the office of a colleague or a supervisor and says, you know, you're not really quite able to do this job anymore? It's a very awkward thing to have to do.
It certainly is incredibly difficult. And of course, in the UK, there are all sorts of legal safeguards around that. So you cannot, for example, dismiss somebody from a job simply on the basis of their age. Although actually there's kind of an exception to that currently in the House of Lords, where the Labour government has decreed that all peers over the age of 80 will be retired at that point. So that's an interesting exception to that rule. And I guess what's going on there is that we're struggling with the question of exactly as you put it, really, how do you broach the conversation with somebody whose physical ability, whose cognitive ability may not be perhaps what it once was, and therefore enabling them to be effective in their role. And in shying away from that, I guess what we're actually doing is using age as a kind of proxy for the criteria that we might otherwise wish to apply to initiating those conversations and making those kind of decisions.
I wonder whether one of the basic questions isn't for everybody, who gets to decide? Who gets to make crucial inputs into this? We've had some instances in the United States where people turn up with personal physicians that no one has ever heard of or knows the qualifications of, and could be a neighbor, could be a friend, it could be a brother-in-law or a sister-in-law, who knows? MT, do you have any thoughts about this? How do we write some rules about this, or some standards?
Yeah, I was just, as John and Richard were talking, I was thinking about a quote that I heard from Gordon Brown, where he said that he was too old to be a politician in the UK and too young to be a politician in the US. So I think that sort of encapsulates some of what you both were saying. I've been thinking about this a lot, because I feel like the aging field has not really jumped into the breach here in terms of the conversation that's been going on in the US, and not just in the last few months since the debate debacle, but also actually in the last few years. And I think we have to embrace it. And I wonder, I guess one question I have is one entitled to a zone of privacy when it comes to health, cognitive health and or physical health, when one is an elected official or appointed to a body like the Supreme Court? What kind of zone of privacy is one entitled to? And I mean, as Richard said, age is often a proxy for something else. And so, and a lot of my colleagues who are geriatricians have said it's not really age, it's function. And that got me thinking about, is that right? I think it's partially age. Actually, I think it's mostly function. You know, if you look at Nancy Pelosi, she's, you know, a generational politician, perhaps uses power more effectively than any living politician in recent history. And on the other hand, there is a trajectory in terms of both physical and cognitive health with age, with the passage of time. And so I don't think it's only function, because we're projecting out into the future as well. So I actually think that there's an opportunity for, I don't know, you know, something like a commission or a consensus panel to sit down and say, what are the factors? What do you need to reveal by law or by, I mean, I think politicians are often reluctant to give up their power. Patrick Leahy is an exception. He's a senator who stepped down at, I believe, age 82. But I think we need to create some guidance and probably make some rules.
And is there a way to do this internationally? I'd be interested in what John and Richard have to add to this. Could one say, I mean, it's hard enough to get people to agree on a commission within one country, but could one say, this is a commission of the, I don't know, the Western world to try to, or the United Nations somehow, to try to set some international standards that might apply?
I think it also depends on being part of a group in a way, as in a political party. I mean, I had the privilege of being elected unexpectedly very young at 35, and I always never thought I'd last 4 years. And the average lifespan of a member of parliament is actually 12 years, and I managed 23. And then I stepped down because I didn't think you should do those jobs, and I'd had the privilege of being a government minister and the rest for too long, though that is not a common view. Interestingly, I came out at 60 and I serve on charities. And just in the last few weeks, in the charities I am a trustee of, I had to sign a fit and proper declaration. So as well as conflicts of interest and a skills audit, I had to sign that I was a fit and proper person in terms that I'd not committed any criminal offences of fraud or violence, but also that I had informed the board of trustees that I was in reasonable health. Now, I never had to sign anything like that at all to stand for Parliament. And simply, and accompanying that from the charity commissioners is guidance on the life cycle of trustees, they call it, suggesting that you serve for 3 years with a renewal. So it's almost as if, and they've actually now said for long-standing trustees, so if you're a trustee of a charity and you've served 3 years and they say, oh, well, we'll have you again, you have to now put that in the annual report back to the charity commissioners to say some of our trustees are on a long time. Now, it doesn't mean they shouldn't be trustees and they don't add value to the trustees, but you have to give a reason for the longevity. But there is also then a further qualification, and that is an exit strategy and a replacement strategy for boards of trustees. And I think in the political groups and in the political parties, sometimes when choosing candidates, that kind of bundle of issues is not properly discussed. We go on history, experience, perhaps at street level and national level, and their personal work experience and their political views, but we don't take account of their contribution to the whole.
I must say that's one area in the United States that's very delicate, is with colleges and universities, how to set terms for trustees and people who are donating their time and contributing the fact is they're usually not just contributing time, but also finances. And nobody wants to offend somebody who's being financially generous by saying, well, we think maybe it's time for you to step down. So this is multifactorial. Richard, have you figured out any of these questions better than most?
Well, of course, better than most, definitely not, I would think. But it's certainly the case. I'm involved with on the council of 2 universities and a number of charities, some small, some very large here in the UK. For each of those, it is actually very clear indeed. So as John has recounted, there's an initial term of office, 3 years or 4 years. That's a maximum. And trustees are usually able to serve a second term, but they would be prevented. There is no question of them remaining as a trustee for more than 2 terms. So each of the universities I'm involved with, each of the charities, that's into the statutes of the institution. So so there is a cut-off after whatever the maximum period is, 6 years or 8 years, depending on the status of the particular institution. One of the things that does strike me, however, is that I was talking to a young man recently on a train, a young African man who came to study in Swansea, and he remained, set up a company, he was very successful. And he was talking to me about public service. He was very interested in becoming involved in public service. Now, he was about early 30s, early to mid 30s. And he said to me, of course, what you really want is lots of retired directors on your boards. And I said, well, actually, no, we do want some people like that. But that means you only get one kind of perspective. And the challenge for us, with some of the boards that I'm on now, is to find people who bring more diverse perspectives, not only from ethnic or cultural backgrounds, but also in terms of relative age or youth, to provide a broader range of perspectives. And I wonder if maybe there's a supplementary question to the question we've posed here, which is how do we best enable people of different ages and abilities to contribute to public service? I think that's the question that perhaps we're starting to wrestle with a little more here in the UK.
Go ahead, MT, please.
I think that's a hugely important subject. And at least here in the United States, we have an incredibly age-segregated society. Older people generally are either isolated alone or segregated together with other older people. And there's very little sort of structural intergenerational opportunity. And I think that, and then we also have these norms of retirement that were really built for when we lived 65 or 70 years. And so suddenly you get your plaque and your pen and you're done. And we don't really have good off-ramps to meaningful next acts, and we don't think about them properly in advance. And I think that is really important when we're thinking about politicians too. If there were an honorable alternative, on the federal bench, there's something called senior status, where the judges still can sit on cases, et cetera, et cetera. But if we really thought about how do we still benefit from what the older politicians bring in a way that is recognized and respected, and there's dignity attached to it, as opposed to sort of this vicious ageism of like, get out of the way. Because I think, as you imply, Richard, there's a lot of benefit to intergenerational activity. And actually there's a sort of a BMW, what's called the BMW study, that sort of serves as a metaphor here, where they found that the younger workers were fast and error prone, and the older workers were slow and error free. And when they had an intergenerational workforce, it was faster and had fewer errors. So I think if we use that as a parable, it's a useful one.
Indeed.
I think as well, there's the statistics in Leeds were out recently to show that people in the south of England, one of the towns in the south of England, live a healthy life and are active up to 70. But in Leeds, it's to 58. So if you've got to allow for younger people the space, and I would push that right down the range to including young people as well. And the reason I mention that is that I do think I completely agree with MT that politicians need to find a way to get out of the way when they've served and served well, and even if they lose the election, to be respected for losing and to be enabled to do other things instead. And I'm not sure that there's that exit strategy at all for politicians. I've got interestingly, it's Harry Truman, a little quote from him above my desk. It says, "It's amazing what you can achieve if you don't mind who takes the credit." And I think it's a case for politicians to make space. The person that, as it were, the baton was passed on to in my constituency is now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, who's 39. And she's much brighter than me, and she lives in a different world. I did not grow up in the world of the internet and social media and the speed of change. I went to the Apple shop to get the machine I'm talking to you on, and we had a discussion about the difference between old men like me, who might have conferred wisdom, or was I really synonymous with built-in obsolescence because I wasn't keeping up with the technology? And I think keeping up with the pace of change and technology as we move into the digital landscape is a massive question as well. It's personal as well as societal.
John, I want to come back to this notion of whether it's the people in the shops who have to pick up, who have to notice who's no longer quite as capable, or if there might be some other body created. But I don't want to let go of the fact that the productive average time in Leeds is 12 years shorter than people in the south of England. And that's a very dramatic statistic. And what is the explanation for that? And Richard, I'd be interested in what the comparable statistic is, if you have a sense of it, in Wales. But go ahead, John.
Well, I think it's health. It is the nature of the shift from post-industrialization. It is the changing demographic of the population. So we've challenges in the north that are not the same, for example, in the Greater London region. And it means that people are not as healthy. There's a health divide in the UK. That's not, it's a function of inequality, basically, that's quite strong. But what it means is someone in our community where I live who's 62 would not be as fortunately fit as I am and would look on me as a rarity at 73. And yet you have to make space for their voice before they hit 62. Otherwise, they won't get a say.
Richard?
I don't really have the sense of that accurately for Wales. I think the population in Wales, in common with the rest of the UK, we're tending towards an aging population overall. I think our health performance is actually below average compared to the rest of the UK. There was an interesting study done in the UK recently as to perceptions of old age. And when they talked to younger people, that is people who are below the age of 40, they thought old age began at the age of 67, which I'm greatly encouraged by, because that means I'm still middle-aged. But when they spoke to people who were in their 60s, their perception of old age was that it started at the age of 71. So the whole notion of old age is, in fact, it's not a fixed point. And our perceptions will change, perhaps, not only as we age, but in terms of our social conditions and economic conditions and so on. It's a very complex picture. And one of the things that we assume, of course, is that with age comes experience. And experience is often taken as another proxy, I suppose, for wisdom. But that's not necessarily true, is it? I mean, we've demonstrated that in our political circles in the UK quite recently, that experience does not equate to wisdom necessarily. And so the kind of veneration one might wish to have for old age is sometimes, I think, a little rosy tinged. If you understand what I mean?
MT, before you reply about this experienced wisdom conundrum, do you think there are dramatic differences in the United States, like the one that's just been described in the United Kingdom? 12 years difference in regionally, ethnically, or in across some other divide?
Yes. Whereas the average life expectancy is 78 years, the average healthy life expectancy is 66, and it varies dramatically by education level, race, poverty, gender, all kinds of, ethnicity. It's an inequitable health span, like lifespan, is inequitably allocated, as John was suggesting. So it's yes, so that's that. And actually, I've come to think that health span and lifespan are too limiting also. I mean, as Richard was saying, age does not necessarily, it's sort of a stereotype.
Just a number, right? That's what we're always told. It's just a number.
Yeah, I mean, but also, we aren't automatically wise because we accumulate years. And I mean, the data are that aging is wild, there's wild heterogeneity. If you put a bunch of 2-year-olds in a room together, they can all do about the same thing, from a developmental perspective. If you put 100 82-year-old or 92-year-olds in a room together, there's wild diversity. And if you look at the politicians we're thinking about, that there's wild diversity there too, in terms of all the things that we're talking about. So it's it's much harder to pin down. The Onion had a headline once that said stereotypes save you time, but when it comes to age, when it comes to aging, it's not true, actually.
Right. There are. I don't want us to lose this question of physical ability and along with mental acuity. There's one recent example in the United States that I find very inspiring, and I don't know how widely it's been talked about. There's a man called David Tatel, T-A-T-E-L. He was a federal appellate judge for a very long time in the federal appellate court in Washington, D.C., below the Supreme Court. He is blind. He has been blind, I think, all his life, certainly all the time that he served as a judge. And he's now written a book about his experiences as a blind judge or a blind man doing that job. And it seems that his capacity to do the job may have been enhanced by his infirmity rather than diminished. And maybe that's an oversimplification. Are you familiar with that case, MT?
Yeah, actually, I know David, and his wife Edie was also my ex-husband's 3rd grade English teacher. So, and they lived very, very close to us. One of his daughters babysat for us. Yes, I think he's an inspiration. He's an extraordinary human being. He's a brilliant judge. And I think what you're, pointing to is a really significant issue, which is that, and one that the people in the disability rights movement make a lot, which is that, abilities are very differently allocated, and sometimes having, we overcompensate sometimes in ways that are quite extraordinary. And that is, I think Richard made the point that we don't appreciate the importance of really diverse abilities and the different perspectives that are brought. And I think that's really important when you think about complex systems that are involved in governance, whether it's, whether it's a parliament or a Congress. These are unbelievably complex systems. And so having a lot of different types of experience and minds at a table and capacities is even more important than in other kinds of less complex systems.
We had a brilliant example in the British Parliament in the Blair government with a very good friend of mine and colleague, David Blunkett, who was blind from birth. He was told he was going to be a piano tuner for life and went to a special school to train to be a piano school. He led the Council of Sheffield here near us in Leeds in the north of England and became a cabinet minister and is now serving in the House of Lords. His memory is incredible. And I think that enhanced capacity that you mentioned, it was genuine for David as well. But I would just ask on a personal note, and it is a question around the performance of leaders. And that is, if you feel, and I am starting to, that it's a bit like if you're driving and you get to my age, you know that your reactions on the road, your physical reactions between your eyesight and your hands and the brake and the wheel, they're not as fast as they were when I was 25 to 35, now at 70. So I ask, are my mental reactions and my memory, and we need fast reactions in speech and memory in politics, are they as good as they should be to hold the ring? And sometimes I kind of feel, well, I can read a script into a teleprompter, but if I'm put on a panel and ask questions, I might not be as bright at all. And I think there are questions there about whether people will give anybody any leeway if they're not bright and sharp when they're at the top of politics.
So far, so good today, John. Thank you for that. Richard, do you think yourself about whether there's a moment when you might need to step down from some things that you're doing? Do you worry? Do you think actively about these issues?
I do indeed. I formally retired from working as a university leader about just before the pandemic struck us. But I'm not a gardening and golf sort of guy, so I got very involved in institutions as a trustee, as a governor, as a council member. And before taking each of those on, I really asked myself why I wanted to do it and what it was I felt that I could contribute. So there was a lot of soul searching that went on before I accepted each of the invitations to do the things I currently do. And I kind of made a pact with myself to sort of conduct an audit, if you like, a self-audit every year, just to check on whether I genuinely feel that I could answer those same questions in a positive way. And I feel it, maybe this is to do with my Welsh conformist, non-conformist upbringing, I don't know, but I feel there's a kind of moral imperative there for me, really. I don't do these things for any pay. I don't do them for any sort of sense of self-aggrandizement. I've had a good career. I don't need that kind of ego massaging now. It's important to me to do these things that are meaningful. But in order to make them meaningful, I really have to be in the right place to do that. And so there's a kind of moral pact I've made with myself to undertake that audit annually to ask the question, could I still answer those questions positively in regard to this particular role? And I'm sure that the time will come when I will start stepping back. In fact, my role my appointment on the Board of Careers Wales is a ministerial appointment, and I'm due to finish in 18 months' time. And I'm sure at that point, I will not seek to replace that role with another one.
I think that's a very admirable process that you've engaged in for yourself. I might just mention to the people who are tuned in that now would be a good time to put any questions or comments you might have into the Q&A button, because we'll be moving back to Mike in a few minutes, to Mike Scott, to take up those questions. But before we do, MT, I want to start this one other angle. Do you find yourself sometimes thinking back and looking at, it could be recent history, it could be more distant, and wondering whether the people who made certain decisions or acted in a certain way or engaged in a certain process were in full possession of their faculties at the time, and whether the course of history might have been different if there had been younger people or different people who had replaced them, not necessarily younger, but different abilities. I think of well, I mean, this is an international thing. I think of Charles de Gaulle as one that because I was living in France and writing about French, the dramatic events in France at that time, many years ago, 55 years ago. But Ronald Reagan, the issue comes up. He was he could turn a phrase so well. He could, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev, etc. But some people wonder whether he was really at the top of his game his full time in office. And there are many others to think about that way. I wonder sometimes about Mrs. Thatcher. Was that an issue in the UK? Did she stay too long? And so is this a useful field of inquiry, MT?
It's certainly, I mean, I think the recent example of Dianne Feinstein is a unfortunate example in that regard. And, the conversations about or debates about Ronald Reagan's second term. I mean, Strom Thurmond, a senator from South Carolina, segregationist, stayed in the Senate until he was 100. Apparently, one of his colleagues said that his will is stronger than his health. But going into I was thinking, John, when you were talking about signing a certification, sometimes you get to a point where you can no longer actually know whether the certification is accurate in terms of your own capacity, right? I mean, at some point, one is, the self-audit might be all fine and good, but perhaps one's capacity to perform a self-audit is no longer there. So I think William O. Douglas on the Supreme Court, that was, there are many examples, I think, of what you're talking about, Sandy, and important ones to bring back, although they go back to ancient times. They're just going to keep accelerating, I think, now, given the demographics. This might be a little bit delusional on my part, but I feel like this is, everybody gets old. People of all parties and political persuasions age and are struggling with this issue. And actually, the Pew Research Center, I think last year, did a study suggesting that like 79% of Americans think that there should be a maximum age for elected officials. And I think 74% think there should be a maximum age for Supreme Court justices. So I think we need to have a conversation not about any one person or party, and perhaps a more generous kind of conversation, really thinking about what, the contributions and the meaning making. Because Richard, as you were talking, I thought, I don't want you to leave. I think your voice, from what you've said, can make really tremendous contributions. And we are too inclined, I think, to, there's tremendous ageism. I mean, it's this weird paradox, right? Where older people have disproportionate electoral power, power in governing, and wealth, and yet also old and proud is not a thing. All of us are horrified by the idea of aging, and culturally, there's a lot of shame and fear and even disgust associated with it. So it's this strange paradox that actually, I think, taps down our the ways, sort of the paths for contribution, which really we have not done a good job of cultivating, including in political life, for example, mentorship and that sort of thing. So I think there are, if we combine some sort of national conversation about both doing a better job at figuring out how to limit what you're talking about, Sandy, which is people who, we're electing human beings, not their staff. Yeah. So we, making sure that the people we elect have the capacity to fulfill the job on the one hand, and on the other hand, figuring out off ramps that really are meaningful ones where we can still appreciate and benefit from the accumulated knowledge. So
we had one prime minister, a Labour prime minister, Harold Wilson, who unexpectedly resigned as prime minister because he felt he was getting dementia, and he had a brilliant photographic memory. And then someone delivered a letter to him, and he couldn't remember the number on the motorbike that delivered the letter to number 10. And he said, "I feel my memory's going," and he stepped down, which was a really strong position that he felt that he was losing it. And that is very, very rare. I would just say, though, and I really benefited from Richard's comments, and I completely concur with him and try to get somewhere near. I totally agree. It's a moral responsibility to assess. But perhaps, I'm blessed with a wife, a family, and grandchildren, and they, if you have a group around you that help you do that assessment, it helps, doesn't it? And I think it's that you don't need to be personally limiting yourself or making your own self-assessment. Work with the people you're gifted to have around you, friends, neighbors, and family, to help decide what you are capable of doing as you get older. And I think that's not a thing that happens in politics, unfortunately.
No, and I have to say, when I talked to you about a self-audit, I didn't mean that was entirely introspective. That would be taking in the views of a range of other people as well.
One point that you brought up, MT, that I just think is worth emphasizing is that there was a lot of confusion recently in the United States. This tremendous, one should not minimize the magnitude of the decision that President Biden had to make and was under great pressure to make. But I think a lot of people could legitimately ask the question, was it being evaluated in terms of what he could do, or what certain members of his staff, whether they might have been wanting to hold on, and whether that was more important to them than really a kind consideration of his capacities?
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. And also, as we have a conversation about what kind of guidance and or rules we need, what are the obligations of staff also, I think, in terms of disclosure or because
Absolutely.
right, it's a really, really tricky question for I think for everybody, but and you know, sort of the mirror image of that, which is people's right to privacy and the public's right to know. And you know, I think we need philosophers and ethicists as well as, you know, neuroscientists and geriatricians and historians. We need a lot of really good minds to puzzle through this and take it as an opportunity. I think take what was sort of a national crisis
Right.
as an opportunity to really engage these questions in a meaningful way.
Well, I
Yeah.
think I'm sorry, go ahead, Richard, if you want to add something. We're going to move
Yeah, I
back
was
to
just gonna say,
Mike
I
Scott
think-
in just a moment.
I think Andy's point is really, really good. There are bigger questions than just that one specific example with President Biden. And I think that maybe now is the time, and that will provide the impetus to have that kind of discussion. You know, the series is entitled Free Speech at the Crossroads, International Dialogue. And I really do think that maybe somehow or other we can facilitate some meaningful international dialogue around this issue, whether that's through the UN or UNESCO or whatever. But I really think there's an opportunity here.
Mike Scott, let me come back to you now and see if you've had some issues brought up that you think you want to pursue.
Well, just thinking about old age and myself, old age starts over here, I think, when someone offers you their seat on the tube. When that happens, you know it's you know you've had it. As far as I was concerned, I thought I was about 56, but I must have been older than that. Anyway, and another one, which I felt was old age coming, was when you were at the barber. And, you know, I'm of that generation when I had long locks and so on. And the barber tells you confidentially that you're going bald. That's a major moment in one's life, I think, that you never forget. Old age has come. But I want to ask some serious questions here. First of all, I've been talking about, well, I'll just make another comment. I can remember at primary school, my teacher telling me that there was a man called JFK standing for president. This was a young man standing for president, or seemed a young man standing for president. It was as if a cycle had changed. It's and I felt it also, and John, I'll come to you on this one, with Tony Blair. In my lifetime, Tony Blair came in as a young prime minister, and it was the youth of that prime minister, it was the youth of Kennedy, which just sparked everybody off. I'm a Shakespearean, and I was inspired in the whole of my life in 1964 when I saw a young actor called David Warner playing Richard II, and then in 1965 he played Hamlet, and he played it like my brother, who was at university and was 18, and I thought was the world of him. And he played with a long university scarf. And this old play was suddenly a play for youth, you know? And it's these kind of moments when youth is important. And we tend, when we're talking about old age, when we're talking about these issues, we tend to talk of the old age side of it. And perhaps we should also talk about, you know, I know Wordsworth was wrong really when he said to be young was very heaven, because he was talking about the French Revolution, but he didn't understand where that was going to go. But to be young is very heaven, and it gives an opportunity, and you've got to give people that kind of opportunity as well. So we've got to get the balance right. I don't know, John, you want to talk about Tony Blair?
Yeah, there was that. It was a real sense of youthfulness, wasn't it? And catching the zeitgeist, and you know, wanting the celebrities of the day, the musicians of the day, and the actors and the
Yeah.
comedians of the day, all to gather around him in number 10. And there was that. You remember the great phrase, "A new day has dawned." That great epigraph that some of us cringed at, but never mind. But I puzzle this around. There's an old quotation in the book of Joel, isn't it, in the Bible? And and I always get it confused. All men have dreams, I think it is, and young men have visions. And I've always wanted to know, what's the difference between a vision and a dream? And sometimes I think the vision of Tony Blair was that he would give a new agenda, refreshment and new youth, and that would be the program. And he was a good communicator. But let me then switch to another character, a man the same age as me, who was Jeremy Corbyn, and he was the leader of the Labour Party. And I think he was a dreamer. And he dreamed of a different world, of the economics being radically different. And the youngsters flocked to him in thousands. And Labour got its highest vote under Jeremy Corbyn. Then we actually got a vote in the last election to win a massive majority. And so I'm still confused and trying to tease out, what do we mean when we say old men have dreams and young men, and for that read people, of course, and young people see visions? What's the difference between dreams and visions, and how do we mesh them together in that lovely, I'm tempted to say, synthesis that MT put together of how we need in a democracy a range of voices that's really, really as inclusive as possible? That's the challenge, I think.
Yes, Richard, you want to come back on that?
No, it's just echoing what I said earlier on. The question, one of the key questions, supplementary question for us, is how do we best enable the widest range of age and ability to contribute to public life in a meaningful way? So that exactly as John was saying now, and I think MT's really coming from the same place, really.
There's another question that comes in on that, and it's, is there a difference between age and time served in a particular post? Do we get the two things mixed up?
I think for me, the two things are not necessarily the same, but they are of course not unrelated. So you can't have, you could be quite elderly and serve in a post for a relatively short space of time, but it would not be possible to be very young and serve in a post for a very long period of time. So whilst they're not synonymous, there is a link between them.
I think there's a question of, that word legacy. And I had the great privilege of serving for a long time in politics. I had the great privilege of serving as a government minister. I had the great privilege of being re-elected and not thrown out and been respected for it. And I kind of think, what is my legacy? I haven't written any books. I served the people as best I could. But I think the legacy is to open space for the next generation, not to have a monument stuck in a graveyard somewhere. So what would be my legacy? Not a great, a monument with my name on it, but would it be that younger people feel that they've got the space to express their views and be in dialogue with older people who really listen to them? And I find in our society at the moment, where I work as a volunteer now in the community, that the gap of people being unable to listen to young people is just too wide. And that then generates other kinds of problems, even including some recent ones we've had on the streets and between different ethnic minority communities, because the young people don't think or feel they've got the space to express themselves, develop and grow. And I think that's the biggest challenge of all. So the question of a person's legacy might not be what traditionally it has been or it ought not to be.
MT.
Well, going to your question, Mike, I think I agree with Richard that they're different. There's life experience and experience in an institution are two different things, and can make different kinds of contributions. I was struck, Nancy Pelosi just came out with a book where she talks about intuition, that you have to have incredible intuition. Well, of course, intuition informed by decades of experience is a different kind of intuition that allows you to act with more decisiveness than uninformed intuition, shall we say, and gives you a kind of confidence to act in a public capacity, which we just saw demonstrated, if the rumors are true, that she was in fact the most important voice in terms of sort of encouraging Biden to step down. So I think, they're, yeah, so I think they're different in response to your question, but not unrelated.
We go to another question. Is there a problem that people who are moving towards retirement have got the fear of a vacancy in their lives once they retire, and that there's a social problem here that there ought to be considered? John?
In politics, I mean, I remember when, in the year that I first stood in '87, I was campaigning, and I went to campaign for a man who was in his 50s, who'd been serving for 10 years as an MP, and he lost his seat, and it was in another part of, it's over in Lancashire. And I got elected in Yorkshire, and I kept in touch with him. 3 years after he'd been elected, he died. And his wife told me that she compared it to a drip. He said politics was a drip in his arm, and when it was pulled out, he gave up. And I found that quite more typical than people imagine. And it is that question, and it's a question being asked in Parliament now by the Speaker of the House of Commons, because a lot of MPs have lost their seats this time, of all parties. What do they do next? What's their next part of their personal journey? And if there's no encouragement from anyone and no advice from anyone, they can end up quite desperate. And that does worry me, that there's not an exit support structure, if you like, or advice structure or accompaniment structure. Because I did find in politics that politics is a bit like it's adrenaline driven. It's an addiction. And if that's your whole life without what Dennis Healy used to refer to as his hinterland of music and poetry, then you could get so absorbed in it that when you come out, you're lost. And I think that is a real challenge, where people do feel that vacant factor once they've been in politics.
Speaking personally, I think I hinted at this earlier on. I retired at the age of 60. I was forced into retirement by the pandemic, actually. I was leaving the north of England to come back to Wales, and one of my old universities approached me about going back there. We were in the middle of discussing that when we did the pandemic, and that was the end of that. And so I retired. But I couldn't possibly face a retirement of inactivity, of walking by the sea is wonderful. I'm able to do that every day, but there has to be more challenge and more stimulation than that. And also, it's not just challenge and stimulation for me, but a sense that I'm doing something that is meaningful for society, and living a life that was useful. There's a lot of philosophy behind that, of course. In Roman times, people were valued by what they could contribute to society. So that was very important to me in deciding to do the things I do. My wife tells me I've gone too far in the other direction, and that so this business of retirement, she says, You seem to be as busy as ever. It's just that nobody pays you anymore. So, which is not wrong. But for me, and it seems colleagues from the organisations I'm involved with think as well that I'm able to do something useful. And I remember an early conversation with a former colleague. He said to me, "Richard, you've never had so much experience. It'd be a great shame for that to go to waste." And I've never forgotten that. So hopefully that experience is useful for other people, and that's, I suppose, helpful for me then in leading a meaningful life.
MT, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question. I wrote a book that took me a very long time to finish, but writing the last chapter came as a complete surprise to me and really changed how I lived, because mostly it was about how to navigate the challenges of aging, but there is the way we've built our societies, are based on people who live shorter lives, 65 or 70 years, as opposed to often 80, 90 years. And having this period of often 2-3 decades where suddenly we're expected to just, take walks on the beach or whatever it is often not the way that we want to live. And actually, I'm going to your point, John, the data about especially men who retire are not very good post-retirement. Like the mortality spikes 2 years after retirement. And I think it has to do with that sense of identity and purpose being so rooted in work. And so, and there's a lot we can do about this. If we start planning in advance and more effectively and say, okay, what do you want? More gentle and interesting off-ramps. Perhaps we don't have to work 4,000 hours a week or with the same degree of intensity, and perhaps with more flexibility, but most people still want to find purpose in how they spend their days. And that's something and there are a lot of people who can benefit from those contributions. And what we've done a really bad job of is matching up the capacity with the need. And I think that's part of this equation of planning in advance, understanding that a lot of people, myself included, want to keep contributing in some meaningful way. And what that looks like is maybe similar to what you did, maybe different from what you did. But we need to really think about these next chapters and planning for them, including in the arena of politics, but not exclusively. I mean, mentoring is a fantastic example. There's so much, there's so much potential benefit there that goes largely unrealized.
Yeah, can we take that further? And I'll come back to you, Richard, from your experience. Being on a board, you often you're often wanting the succession planning being discussed on the board. But what do boards do about retirement planning for the person who's going to be leaving? Is succession planning a criteria that you should have, but is retirement planning also a criteria that you should have right from the start of an appointment?
I think that's a very good observation, Mike, that there is not that retirement planning, exit planning for board members. We are at the moment, we are turning somersaults to try and attract more diverse board members, ethnically, culturally, in terms of ability, physical ability, in terms of youth and so on. We do all sorts of things there. We do, I'm involved in this personally, I absolutely agree with MT in terms of the role of mentoring. And what we are doing now with a lot more with public service positions in the UK is doing a lot more mentoring. And it's not just people who are appointed to the boards. What we're now doing is bringing people on board in a co-opted capacity to a particular committee, or we even have what are called board apprenticeships, where people join. They're not voting board members, but they attend meetings, they get the papers, they can participate in discussion, they're mentored by more experienced, established board members. So we're doing a lot around that. And unfortunately, at the end of your allotted, 3 or 6 or 8 years, whatever it is, you kind of fall off a cliff, and that's the end of that. I was thinking recently, a colleague on the trustee in the National Museum of Wales retired, an incredibly bright man, incredibly experienced, was well, he basically invented the Erasmus scheme, which you'd be familiar with, Mike, and he was
Oh, I
director
know
of
who you
theatre.
mean. Yeah, yeah,
You know, Howard Carey, well,
yeah.
massively able man. But when he finished, you know, and there was no opportunity other than very informally to meet him for coffee and that kind of thing. So I really think we could do a much better job of that. Even, you know, in universities, professors never leave. They become emeritus professors and they continue doing research or maybe a bit of teaching. You know, the old joke, professors never retire, they just lose their faculties. So maybe we need to think about that kind of emeritus trustee board member kind of thing that could bring so much value, I think.
Yes, I saw John. You were nodding and you're asking that question.
I think, for example, I sometimes try and persuade fellow politicians, men and women, that in Britain, the voluntary sector, the non-for-profit sector, is expanding massively between the state and business, if you like. As a world, it's expanding massively. It has to register under the charity law and charity commission, and there are great demands now on the charity sector. They need people with experience of law. They need people with experience of budgets. And I remember little charities that try to get going, even doing food banking and things like that, need to put in accounts and to be accountable and transparent, and they struggle with it. So to go to, as we did, to the accountancy groups in Leeds and say, if you've got accountants that are retiring, will you please get them to talk to us and we'll put you in touch with a charity that's desperate. Similarly with lawyers, and similarly with politicians who do know their way around laws and budgets and something to do with community interaction with the state at local and national level. So I think there's a big piece of space there as there is going to be, as there is in Britain, a contraction of the state actor all the time doing everything at local and national level, and it not shifting across to business to fill in, that there's that space in between that's growing and growing and growing, but it needs the backup of the expertise of exactly the people that perhaps we're talking about.
Thank you. MT.
Yeah, you know, it occurs to me that the broader topic, a lot of it is about contraction, right? That we're limiting, how do we say you don't have capacity? How do we push people out? And if we pair these two things, that there are, if we really have meaningful pathways to continue contributing, and couple that with, you know, better rules or customs around how we construct public service and its longevity, I think then it's not just a punitive exercise, but it recognizes we're living longer. How do we really reconsider our norms around service and work and contribution? And by the way, it's huge in terms of health. I mean, that was the thing that shocked me the most in terms of doing the research, is just how connection and purpose and you know, even sort of creativity all have a huge role, not just in our cognitive and mental well-being, but also in our physical well-being. And so it's you know, it's a win-win-win, I think, if we can think about it in a more expansive sort of way.
I think that's a great statement to make as we come to the end of our very, very fine discussion today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and you know, Sandy ran a university college. I ran a university, and we both came to a retirement. But we found something else, which was to engage people such as you in debates, and I hope it keeps us. I hope it keeps us young. I feel it does, to be perfectly honest. You're still working through the issues, and I think all the panel have testified to that. Sandy, do you want to say anything else?
Well, I just want to say I think it's also, I hope it's also bringing our experience to some of these issues and encouraging some younger people and different people to speak about them. This was, think, a very constructive way to take the Biden situation and reach out from it and learn some other lessons and take some affirmations from it of where we need to turn. I want to thank everybody for joining this very good discussion. It's excellent to discuss this topic, not in crisis circumstances. So that was a major step. I want to thank today especially Logan Richmond for filling in for the vacationing John McCabe, who normally runs these programs on the back end for us, and we appreciate Logan's help on this and many other things in the Free Speech Project. And Mike, it's always a pleasure to work for you, and we're not as young as we were when we started, but we're going to keep trying to push on and bring in some younger people every chance we get.
Fine, thanks for that. Thank you, John, Richard, and Mary-Therese. Thank you very much for such a fascinating discussion. And thanks to Sandy for chairing the panel. The next Free Speech Project at Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future Humanities Project will be on Wednesday, September the 25th, when we'll be talking about whether democracies can really be democratic, or are they democratic? That's what we're going to just have a look at that whole issue on September the 25th. We'll have a very pithy title for it, but that's where we're going to with that. Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, that returns on the 21st of October. For today, thanks to colleagues at Georgetown, thanks to Jack DeGioia. I'm sure he's in everyone's thoughts following his recent illness, and we send him our good wishes. The Vice President, of course, Tom Banchoff at Blackfriars, John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and at Campion Hall, Dr. Nick Austin, SJ, the Master of the Hall. My thanks as well to Logan today, who's stepped in for John McCabe. Thanks for John as well, for doing some of the preparatory work to get this Zoom to happen. I'd like to thank all those of you who've been in attendance with us today for your support. I'm Professor Michael Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until next time, everyone, take care, keep safe, continue to enjoy the summer.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.